The desert sun beat down mercilessly, baking the jagged cliffs of the canyon until they shimmered with heat. Fine dust clung to every boot step, each crunch echoing faintly against the stone walls as the Marine Rangers advanced in staggered formation. They had been moving since dawn, packs heavy, rifles raised, their eyes constantly sweeping the uneven ridges above them. The mission was straightforward on paper: intercept a weapons convoy that insurgents were rumored to be smuggling across this treacherous stretch. But in the field, nothing was simple, and everyone in the squad knew a single misstep could cost them dearly. The squad leader, Staff Sergeant Ramirez, signaled with a clenched fist, bringing the patrol to a halt. He raised his binoculars, scanning the winding bends ahead. The canyon was a natural choke point, its narrow path hemmed in by sheer walls that towered like sentinels. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and Ramirez's instincts screamed caution. Behind him, the squad shifted uneasily, rifles resting against shoulders, sweat dripping beneath helmets. The silence of the canyon felt wrong. Even the usual desert winds seemed to have died, as if holding their breath. "Eyes up, watch those ridges," Ramirez ordered, his voice low but firm. The Marines adjusted their stances, scanning the cliffs with narrowed eyes. Private Miller swallowed hard, his hand tightening around the grip of his M4. He was one of the youngest in the squad, fresh from training, his first real combat patrol weighing heavy on his shoulders. Every shadow looked like an enemy. Every rock seemed to hide a rifle barrel. His heart thumped so loudly in his chest, he worried others might hear it. The radio crackled softly in Corporal Jenkins' ear. Command's voice was calm, routine, reminding them of the convoy's expected approach. But Jenkins felt tension rising. The canyon's silence was deafening. He exchanged a glance with Ramirez, who gave a curt nod before signaling the squad forward again. Boots shuffled against sand and stone, the patrol creeping deeper into the narrow pass. It happened all at once. The sharp stutter of automatic fire ripped across the canyon, bullets striking sparks off rock around them. "Contact!" Ramirez bellowed, diving for cover as his squad scattered toward boulders and ledges. The air exploded into chaos, dust clouds rising, the screech of ricochets, the shouts of men calling positions. Enemy fire poured from the ridges above, muzzle flashes flickering like lightning from the rocks. Pinned flat against stone, Miller clutched his rifle to his chest, fear threatening to paralyze him. Bullets cracked inches above his helmet, chips of rock slicing his cheek. His training screamed at him to return fire, but his mind reeled under the sheer ferocity of the ambush. Next to him, Jenkins grabbed the radio, shouting over the gunfire. "This is Ranger 2-1. We're under heavy contact. Grid Delta 9er. Send backup, repeat, send backup." The only answer was more gunfire. Ramirez cursed, peering over his cover long enough to spot the enemy. They had the high ground on both sides, rifles braced against sandbags hidden in natural alcoves. The Rangers had walked into a trap. Grenades detonated against the canyon floor, throwing dirt and shrapnel into the air. The concussion rattled teeth and deafened ears, disorienting the squad further. Ramirez knew the math: his men were pinned, outgunned, and dangerously exposed. "Suppressive fire!" Ramirez shouted, and several Marines leaned out to return bursts toward the ridges. Brass casings spilled against the rocks as their rifles barked, but it was like shouting against a storm. The enemy was entrenched, confident, and relentless. Every attempt to move was punished by a hail of fire that pinned them tighter against their meager cover. Miller finally steadied his shaking hands enough to fire upward. His shot sparked harmlessly against rock, but it gave him a small surge of courage. He glanced at Jenkins, who was still hammering the radio. "Where's backup?" Miller shouted over the chaos. Jenkins shook his head, face grim, static hissing in his earpiece. Another explosion thundered close, hurling dust into the air and leaving ears ringing. The Marines coughed, choking on grit, blinking through the haze. Panic simmered in the group. They were trained for firefights, but being caught in a kill box, cut off with no reinforcements in sight, gnawed at even the most seasoned among them. Ramirez crawled between his men, barking orders, steadying nerves where he could. Hold your fire until you see targets. Don't waste rounds. We're not dying here today. His words cut through the panic, anchoring the squad to discipline. But deep down, he knew they were bleeding time. Every second the enemy pressed their advantage, the Rangers' odds worsened. The canyon became a crucible of noise rifle cracks, grenade blasts, shouts of warning. Dust hung thick in the air, stinging eyes and coating mouths with the taste of stone and cordite. The enemy moved fluidly, confident, shouting in their own tongue as they adjusted positions. They knew they had trapped the Americans. Jenkins pressed his radio again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Command, this is Ranger 2-1. We need immediate support. We're pinned in the canyon. Heavy casualties imminent." The transmission cut with static. He slammed his fist against the rock, frustration written across his face. Miller looked to Ramirez, fear plain in his young eyes. "Sergeant, what do we do?" he asked, voice cracking. Ramirez locked eyes with him, steady and unyielding despite the chaos. "We fight, Marine. We hold until someone hears us. Nobody quits. Not today." But even Ramirez knew the truth. The canyon had become a coffin. Unless something changed, their desperate call for backup might be their last words. The Marines pressed tighter against their cover, hearts pounding, rifles ready as the storm of fire raged above them. And somewhere, high on a distant ridge, unseen and silent, a lone scope tracked the ambushers' positions. A finger tightened on a trigger. Help was closer than the Rangers realized. Sergeant Elena Torres lay flat against the ridge, her body pressed tightly into the dusty stone. From where she was positioned, the whole canyon unfolded like a brutal stage play below her. Through the crosshairs of her scope, she could see the Marine Rangers pinned against boulders, fighting for their lives in the kill zone. Their frantic movements, the spray of dust as bullets slammed into rock, the radio operator's desperate gestures, it all painted a clear picture. The ambush was perfectly executed, the enemy confident. But Torres was there for exactly this reason. Her breath came slow and steady, despite the chaos below. Years of training had ingrained that discipline into her bones. She remembered her instructors' voices during sniper school, drilling into her the fundamentals. Control your breathing, trust the math, and never rush a shot. Her Barrett M107 lay across a flat rock, massive and deadly, its bipod steady against the surface. She checked her wind meter again. Even the slightest cross breeze could shift her bullet by feet at long ranges. And today, the canyon was playing tricks with swirling air currents. She licked her dry lips, eyes never leaving the scope. The insurgents were dug in across the ridges, firing down with merciless precision. Their muzzle flashes winked in and out of the shadows, their confidence evident in how aggressively they leaned into their attacks. Torres knew their type. Fighters who believed the high ground made them untouchable, who thought a trapped patrol was already dead. She exhaled slowly, the sound drowned by the thunder rolling through the canyon. Torres' earpiece crackled with fragmented transmissions from the pinned Marines. She could hear the panic in their voices, the clipped urgency of men who weren't sure if they would see another sunrise. "Send backup. We're losing ground," one voice cried. She shut her eyes briefly, centering herself. She had been in combat before, had heard those same tones too many times. But something about this moment struck deep. These weren't just voices, they were her brothers. She couldn't let them fall. Sliding her cheek firmly against the stock, Torres adjusted her rangefinder, 2,000 meters. The target across the canyon leaned too far from his cover, firing wildly at the patrol below. He thought himself safe, invisible from return fire. He didn't know that she had been waiting for this moment, calibrating every factor: distance, wind drift, humidity, even the way the heat distorted the air. Her finger brushed the trigger lightly, settling into that familiar groove between tension and release. She inhaled, counted, then let the breath drain from her lungs until her body was still. Time slowed. The world narrowed to the crosshairs, floating on her target's chest. She squeezed. The recoil slammed against her shoulder, a familiar thunder that shook her bones. The Barrett's report cracked across the canyon like a lightning strike. She watched through the scope as the insurgent dropped instantly, his body crumpling behind cover that now seemed laughably fragile against her .50 caliber round. Chaos erupted among the enemy. Fighters shouted in confusion, ducking lower, scanning wildly for the unseen marksman who had turned their ambush into a nightmare. Torres didn't pause. She racked the bolt smoothly, chambering another round, and shifted slightly to a new position. She never fired twice from the same spot. Her scope locked onto a second target, this one a squad leader barking orders. He pointed toward the Marines below, rallying his men for a push. Torres steadied her breath again, ignoring the strain in her muscles. She squeezed the trigger, and the second shot roared. Another body fell. The commander's shout cut short mid-word, leaving his fighters stunned. Down below, the Marines lifted their heads in disbelief. Hope flared as they realized someone was watching over them. Ramirez shouted, seizing the moment. "Push forward. Move, move. She's got us covered." The squad erupted into action, shifting from desperate defense to cautious offense. Torres could hear their movements, but her focus remained locked on her deadly rhythm. Fire, relocate, sight, breathe, fire again. She became a ghost in the cliffs, invisible but everywhere, her presence defined only by the echoing thunder of her rifle. Memories of her training days at Camp Leoyne flickered through her mind. Long hours on the range, instructors breaking her down and building her back up until shooting was no longer an act of thought but instinct. They had taught her that the sniper's true weapon wasn't the rifle, it was patience. And now, patience guided her hand as she dismantled the ambush piece by piece. Her targets were not random. She picked leaders first, cutting off enemy coordination. Then she sought out heavy gunners, the ones whose suppressive fire pinned her squad. Each shot was intentional, a thread pulled from the enemy's web until the whole trap began to unravel. But she wasn't invincible. She knew the risk. Already, the insurgents were trying to triangulate her position, firing blindly toward the cliffs in hopes of silencing her. Bullets snapped overhead, chewing into stone just feet from her. She rolled to a new vantage point, hugging the rocks, her heart pounding hard but steady. She relished the danger. It sharpened her senses, reminded her of the stakes. Glancing back through her scope, she saw the effect of her intervention. The Marines were no longer huddled in despair. They moved with renewed energy, advancing in bounds, using her covering fire to reclaim ground. Where panic had ruled minutes earlier, discipline returned. They were Marines again, not cornered prey, but hunters rising from the dust. A voice broke over the radio, one she recognized instantly: Ramirez. "Whoever's up there, keep it coming. We're moving." His tone carried more than gratitude. It carried belief. Torres smiled faintly, the kind of smile only a sniper could allow in the middle of battle. She didn't answer. Words weren't needed. Her reply was the thunder of her next shot, a round that ripped through another insurgent position and sent dust spraying across the ridge. From her vantage point, the battlefield had transformed. What had been a one-sided slaughter was now shifting balance. The enemy's confidence was breaking, the Marine's morale rebuilding with every echo of her rifle. And as long as she had rounds in her magazine, she intended to keep it that way. The canyon boiled with chaos. The enemy pressed harder now, their shouts rising in anger, their rifles hammering the rocks in a furious chorus. The insurgents knew something had shifted. Their perfect ambush, so carefully prepared, was unraveling under the sudden intrusion of thunder from the ridge. They couldn't see her, couldn't place her, but they could feel the presence of the ghost with the heavy rifle. Fear, once an ally, now worked against them. Below, the Marine Rangers clung to survival. Dust and smoke coated their faces. Sweat streaked through grime as they fired back at flashes of muzzle light. Private Miller felt his nerves steel with every shot from above. Where panic had nearly consumed him minutes ago, he now found courage. Each thunderous crack reminded him they weren't alone, that someone up there had chosen to stand between them and death. He fired upward, not blindly this time, but with intent, his rounds echoing Torres' rhythm like a duet. Corporal Jenkins pressed the radio against his ear again, static hissing. He tried command one more time. "This is Ranger 2-1, ambushed in the canyon. Unknown sniper providing cover. We're advancing." His voice carried a tone that hadn't been there before. Not just desperation, but defiance. They weren't pleading anymore. They were fighting back. Staff Sergeant Ramirez barked orders over the din. "Flank left, keep low. Move with your shots." He understood what was happening. Whoever was on the ridge had training, precision, discipline. This wasn't luck. It was skill. And if they sensed their movements with that mysterious guardian, they might just punch through the trap. Up high, Torres wiped dust from her scope with a gloved hand, keeping her breathing slow and steady. Through the crosshairs, she spotted two insurgents preparing to log grenades into the canyon below. She dialed her scope, accounting for the heat shimmer distorting the air. Exhale, squeeze. The first enemy collapsed backward, grenade rolling harmlessly away. Bolt cycle. Adjust. The second fell before he ever pulled the pin. Her shots came like thunderclaps, scattering echoes that rolled off the canyon walls. "Grenadiers down!" Ramirez shouted, seeing the explosions that never came. He seized the moment, signaling his men forward. The Marines sprinted to new cover, firing as they moved. Enemy rounds sparked against the rocks where they had just crouched seconds before. Dust rose, obscuring vision, but their momentum grew. The insurgents shouted louder, furious at being denied their kill. A squad of them scrambled higher along the ridge, searching for the phantom. They fired wildly into the cliffs, bullets striking all around Torres. She hugged the stone, her heart pounding, but her mind calm. Moving quickly, she dragged her rifle to a new firing position, 20 meters down the ridge. She lay flat again, scope to eye, finger poised. To survive as a sniper meant never being predictable. Through the scope, she found her next target's two machine gunners, pinning Ramirez's men from opposite sides of the canyon. She knew she couldn't take both at once. Timing would matter. She exhaled, squeezed. One gunner slumped, his weapon falling silent. The other whipped around in confusion. Torres didn't flinch. Bolt, chamber, squeeze again. The second fell, leaving silence where once there had been murderous rhythm. Ramirez didn't miss the shift. "That's our window. Push through," he roared. The Marines surged forward, shouting as they fired. Miller charged beside Jenkins, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. Every step forward felt like a victory, every fallen enemy proof that the tide was turning. But the insurgents weren't broken yet. From higher up, their commander screamed orders. A new wave of fighters leaned over the ridges, raining fire down into the canyon. Bullets carved into rock, forcing Marines back into cover. The ambush wasn't over, it was evolving. Torres steadied her scope again, locking onto the commander. He was reckless, standing tall, waving his arms to rally his men. Through her crosshairs, he looked larger than life. She let her breath go. The shot cracked like thunder, and the commander dropped instantly. His fighters hesitated, panic rippling across their line. Leaders fell like dominoes when unseen hands pulled the strings. Down below, Miller looked up in awe. "Who's she targeting?" he asked, shouting over the gunfire. Ramirez didn't answer directly. "Whoever she is, she's saving your life. Now keep moving." The firefight stretched on, minutes dragging like hours. Marines advanced step by step, each bound supported by Torres' precise covering fire. The canyon walls echoed with violent explosions, rifle cracks, shouted commands, but beneath it all was the steady, rhythmic punctuation of her Barrett. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a lifeline. Torres paused to reload, sliding a fresh magazine into her weapon. Her muscles ached from the constant repositioning, her shoulder bruised from the Barrett's brutal recoil. But she ignored the pain. Pain meant nothing compared to the men below, who trusted her without even knowing her name. She scanned the battlefield again. The enemy's confidence was eroding. Their fire grew less coordinated, their movements more frantic. They were no longer hunters, they were prey, scrambling under the relentless pressure of precision they couldn't match. Still, Torres knew better than to underestimate desperation. Cornered enemies could be dangerous. She watched as a small group of insurgents broke from cover, sprinting across an exposed ridge to outflank Ramirez's squad. Her fingers settled against the trigger. One fell. Another stumbled, clutching his chest. The third dove for cover, barely escaping. But now their maneuver was broken, their chance at surprise lost. The Marines pressed forward again, seizing more ground. Jenkins shouted updates over the radio, his voice steadier now, carrying not panic but confidence. Miller advanced with his squad, each step carrying him further from fear and deeper into resolve. Ramirez kept his men moving, eyes sharp, barking orders with iron control. And through it all, Torres remained their invisible shield. Every breath she took, every shot she fired, turned the ambush into a battle. The enemy had started this fight with numbers, confidence, and high ground. But Torres had the one advantage they hadn't planned for: precision born of discipline, thunder born of steel. The canyon, once a coffin, now trembled with the sound of survival. The Marines weren't free, yet the enemy still held strong positions, but the balance had shifted. The desperate call for backup had been answered, not by a platoon, not by an airstrike, but by one woman lying in the dust, her finger steady on a trigger, her soul unshaken by the storm. The first shot had been thunder, the second judgment. By the time the third rolled across the canyon walls, fear had gripped the ambushers like a vice. The insurgents, who only minutes earlier were shouting confidently as they poured fire into the valley, now found themselves hesitating. Every time a muzzle flash revealed their position, death followed within seconds. Sergeant Elena Torres lay prone on her perch, cheek pressed firm against the Barrett's stock. The recoil still reverberated through her shoulder, but she welcomed it. That ache was proof that her rifle was singing, that her brothers below had not been abandoned. Her fingers slid back onto the trigger, breath slow, eyes unblinking through the scope. Below, the Marine Rangers felt the battlefield shift. For long minutes they had been prisoners of stone and fire, pinned against rocks as bullets chewed the air around them. Now, with each booming shot from the ridge, the noose loosened. Where once they had cowered in desperation, they now pressed forward with renewed determination. Private Miller scrambled from one outcropping to the next, his M4 tucked tight into his shoulder. His chest still heaved with fear, but adrenaline overrode hesitation. When he glanced up, he could almost believe the thunder belonged to something greater than human, a guardian angel hidden in the cliffs. He shouted to Jenkins as they advanced, "She's taking them apart. We can push." Jenkins didn't waste words. He simply nodded, laying down bursts of suppressive fire to cover their movement. Staff Sergeant Ramirez barked orders, his voice steady and commanding, every syllable carrying the authority of experience. "Move with her shots. When she hits, you advance. Trust the cover she's giving us." His men obeyed, weaving through dust clouds, their timing now choreographed with the rhythm of the sniper above. Torres chambered another round. Her scope tracked an enemy rifleman who had pinned Miller's fire team moments earlier. The man's eyes darted nervously, searching for the phantom he couldn't find. Torres exhaled. A crack of her rifle shattered his search, his body slumping across the sandbag wall. She shifted instantly, crawling a few feet to a new firing angle. The insurgents fired back in panic, their shots riddling the ridge with sprays of rock and dust. But Torres knew they were blind. She was already gone by the time their bullets reached her last position. The ghost in the canyon kept moving, her thunder striking from nowhere and everywhere at once. Down in the valley, the Marines surged forward. Each advance was a gamble, but Torres covering fire tilted the odds in their favor. Grenades exploded, sending shockwaves reverberating across stone walls. Shrapnel whined through the air, dust and debris choking vision. Yet through the chaos, the Marines found momentum, step by step, led by Ramirez's relentless commands and shielded by Torres' unerring aim. The insurgents tried to regroup. Their shouts echoed across the canyon as leaders attempted to rally fighters to new positions. Torres watched through her scope, selecting targets with methodical calm. Leaders first, that was doctrine. She squeezed the trigger, and one commander collapsed mid-gesture, his arm still pointing when the round tore through him. She worked the bolt, settled again, and struck down another who had begun to mount a machine gun. The effect was devastating. Without leaders, the enemy's coordination fractured. Panic bled into their ranks. Fighters huddled lower behind their cover, afraid to expose themselves. Some fired blindly into the valley, wasting ammunition in desperate defiance. Others shouted warnings in their language, pointing toward the ridges, but none dared risk standing tall enough to scan for her. The Marines exploited the hesitation. Jenkins and Miller's fire team advanced deeper into the canyon, laying down suppressive fire, while others flanked to stronger positions. Each movement was dangerous. Bullets still whined overhead. Explosions still rattled the earth, but Torres' relentless rhythm made every inch one feel possible. One Marine shouted through the chaos, his voice half awe, half disbelief. "Who the hell is she?" Ramirez snapped back without looking. "Doesn't matter. She's on our side. Now move." Up on the ridge, Torres paused to reload. Her gloved fingers worked with practiced efficiency, sliding a fresh magazine into the Barrett. Her shoulder throbbed from the punishment of repeated shots, but pain was irrelevant. She wasn't fighting for comfort. She was fighting to tip the scales. Her brothers below needed her, and she had no intention of failing. She glanced down at the Marines again, watching them rally under her thunder. Pride stirred quietly in her chest, though she allowed no distraction. Through her scope, she found another target, a sniper, belly flat against the rocks, trying to line up on Ramirez. Torres calculated quickly, recognizing the duel about to unfold. She tightened her focus. One heartbeat, 2, 3. The shot rang, echoing like a hammer strike against the canyon walls. The enemy sniper's rifle clattered to the rocks, his body limp. Ramirez never knew how close death had crept. The Marines pushed harder. Their voices rose with confidence now, battle cries filling the canyon. They no longer sounded like men clinging to survival, but like warriors taking back ground that was theirs. Each foot of progress came at cost, but it was cost they were willing to pay with Taurus above them, anchoring their hope. The enemy line wavered further. Torres spotted fighters retreating from exposed positions, abandoning sandbag nests that only minutes earlier had seemed invincible. Their trap had become a cage, and the thunder from the ridge rattled their will. Ramirez saw it too. "They're breaking. Keep pressure," he shouted, his voice fierce with determination. Miller and Jenkins exchanged a quick look, then charged forward, firing as they went. They slid into new cover just as Torres' rifle cracked again, cutting down another hostile who had aimed for their flank. The canyon that had once felt like a grave now pulsed with life. Dust, smoke, and thunder mingled in a symphony of chaos, but within it, the Marines found their rhythm. Every shot from Torres echoed like a drumbeat to which they marched forward. On the ridge, Torres' breathing grew heavier, but her eyes remained sharp. She knew the battle wasn't won yet. Desperation could drive the enemy to fight harder, to launch one last counterattack. She couldn't let her guard down. She scanned again, hunting for the next threat, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, ready to unleash another storm. For the first time since the ambush began, the Marines felt something close to belief. They had been trapped, pinned, certain they wouldn't survive. Now, with every echo of Torres' thunder, they saw a path forward. The canyon was no longer a coffin. It had become a proving ground. And at its heart was the sniper on the ridge, unseen, untouchable, and unstoppable. The battle was no longer a one-sided slaughter. With each blast from Torres' Barrett, the canyon's balance shifted. The Marines, who had minutes earlier been counting bullets and bracing for the inevitable, now found themselves advancing, not recklessly, but with purpose. For the first time since the ambush began, hope breathed through their ranks. Staff Sergeant Ramirez knew momentum was fragile. He barked orders in sharp bursts, ensuring his men didn't confuse confidence with invincibility. Stay low. Bound forward. 2 men at a time, always covered. His voice cut through the noise, anchoring his men's discipline even as adrenaline surged through their veins. Private Miller felt it most. His heart still thundered, but not with helpless fear. He crouched beside Jenkins, sweat streaking down his dust-caked face. "She's not letting up," he muttered, half in awe, half in disbelief. Jenkins smirked, checking his rifle's magazine. "Then neither are we." The two surged forward, hugging the canyon wall, their boots sliding in gravel as they dove into a new fighting position. Above them, Torres scanned through her scope, adjusting her position to track the shifting flow of battle. She had no radio, no direct link to Ramirez's men, but their movements spoke volumes. She could read their momentum, anticipate where they needed her most. Her eye caught the flicker of movement, a machine gunner setting up to cut off Miller's team. Calm steadied her breath. The trigger broke, and the heavy figure collapsed before he could even chamber around. Miller glanced up toward the ridge instinctively, though he couldn't see her. "Thank you," he whispered under his breath, before snapping his aim back downrange. The enemy fought with fury, born of desperation. Their shouts echoed, guttural and sharp, as they tried to rally against the Marines' push. Rockets streaked from concealed launchers, exploding against canyon walls and showering fragments of stone. One blast knocked Corporal Davis off his feet, tearing through his pack and sending him sprawling. He groaned, clutching his side. Instantly, 2 Marines rushed to drag him back into cover, bullets snapping dangerously close around them. Ramirez dropped beside them, assessing quickly. Davis was bleeding, but conscious. The corpsman began working immediately, pulling gauze and tourniquets from his kit. Ramirez turned his head, jaw tight, and bellowed to the rest. "Keep moving. Don't stop for us. Push them back." The order carried. The Rangers pressed forward, anger and loyalty welded together. Each man knew hesitation meant more blood spilled, so they drove onward, fueled by the thunder from above. Torres tracked another hostile creeping toward a flank. Her finger tightened, the Barrett roared, and the canyon shook once more. But this shot was different. As the recoil slammed into her shoulder, Torres felt a tremor run through her core. She paused, breathing hard, sweat sliding beneath her helmet. She had been firing relentlessly, her body absorbing punishment from every shot. Her muscles ached, but she clenched her jaw. Pain was temporary. Failure was forever. She steadied herself again. The Marines seized a sandbag nest, Miller and Jenkins leading the charge. Inside, they found abandoned weapons and spent casings, a position once held with confidence, now deserted in fear of the sniper's wrath. Jenkins planted himself behind the sandbags, firing bursts to cover Miller's reload. Miller laughed grimly. "Feels good to be the one shooting down at them for once." The canyon echoed with overlapping chaos, the rattle of rifles, the boom of grenades, the distant thunder of Torres' rifle. Smoke and dust thickened, stinging eyes and burning lungs, but the Marines pushed forward step by step. Each advance was bought with blood, yet each was also a victory. Ramirez spotted their new line taking shape and seized the moment. Push left. Cut them off before they regroup. His hand chopped through the air, directing fire teams. The Rangers obeyed, splitting and maneuvering. From the ridge, Torres read their intentions and shifted her overwatch, punishing any enemy that dared expose themselves. One insurgent squad tried to mount a counterattack, sprinting across open ground to flank the Marines. Torres adjusted quickly, leading them in her scope. One shot dropped the first, his body tumbling mid-stride. The others froze, instinctively diving for cover, but there was none. She worked the bolt, exhaled, and fired again. Another fell. The survivors broke and scattered, their resolve shattered by the ghost above. Ramirez heard the familiar thunder and knew without seeing what had happened. He allowed himself a brief moment of gratitude. Whoever she wasn't just saving lives, she was shaping the outcome of the entire fight. Still, the price weighed heavy. Corporal Davis wasn't the only casualty. Another Marine screamed as shrapnel tore across his leg. A rifle jammed mid-fire, forcing its owner to dive for cover and draw his sidearm. Exhaustion gnawed at every man, lungs burning from smoke and strain. Yet they pressed on, because the alternative, being pinned and slaughtered, was unthinkable. Torres paused between shots, rolling her shoulder and biting back a groan. She thought of her training, the endless drills that had honed her body and mind to endure beyond limits. She reminded herself why she was there. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for the Marines pinned below. She whispered to herself, a mantra steady as her heartbeat. One more shot. One more breath. Don't stop now. The battle dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity. The canyon was a cauldron of sound and fury, but beneath the chaos was rhythm. Marines advancing, Torres covering, insurgents breaking. It was a rhythm of resilience, of grit forged in fire. Finally, Ramirez's men reached a choke point where the canyon narrowed. From here, the enemy's advantage waned. Their high ground was less commanding, their fields of fire reduced. Ramirez recognized the shift instantly. He raised his voice, fierce and certain. This is where we break them. Hold the line and push them out. The Marines dug in, trading fire with the remaining insurgents. Grenades arced overhead, exploding in thunderous bursts that rattled teeth. Every explosion was matched by the crack of Torres' rifle, her presence constant, her impact undeniable. For the first time since the ambush began, Ramirez allowed himself to believe they might survive. He didn't know who the sniper was, didn't know how long she could hold, but he knew one thing: his men weren't beaten. Not anymore. Above, Torres exhaled slowly, steadying her aim once more. Through the scope, she saw the Marines holding strong, saw their will hardened by every inch of ground gained. The battle wasn't over, but the tide was turning, and she would make damn sure it stayed that way. The canyon had shifted from a killing ground into a battlefield of opportunity. What had begun as desperation was now a push forward, relentless and unforgiving. Every Marine knew it. Every insurgent felt it. The tide that had threatened to drown the Rangers was now dragging their enemies toward collapse. Staff Sergeant Ramirez pressed himself against a jagged boulder, barking new orders. "Alpha Team, push right. Bravo, keep the pressure up. We're breaking them." His voice carried strength, but his eyes betrayed urgency. He knew this was the moment. If they didn't seize the initiative now, the enemy would regroup. Torres steadied her cheek against the Barrett's worn stock. Sweat trickled from beneath her helmet, stinging her eyes, but she ignored it. Through her scope, the canyon unfolded like a chessboard. The insurgents were moving erratically now, scattered and panicked. Leaders shouted orders, desperate to hold their ground. She marked them first. Her breathing slowed. Trigger squeezed. The rifle cracked like thunder. One fell, then another, their commands silenced mid-syllable. Down below, Miller advanced alongside Jenkins, their boots pounding over dust and shattered rock. They had gone from crawling like prey to charging like predators. Miller's lungs burned, but he grinned fiercely behind gritted teeth. "They're running scared." He shouted. Jenkins only answered with gunfire, mowing down an enemy who had popped up too slowly from behind cover. The insurgents fired back in bursts, but their accuracy faltered. They were reacting, not dictating. Every movement drew the sniper's wrath from above. A man who peeked over a rock wall caught a round to the chest. Another, sprinting to drag a wounded comrade, crumpled mid-stride. The canyon had become a gauntlet, and Torres was its executioner. Ramirez caught a glimpse of Miller's squad reaching another sandbag nest, their shouts echoing over the gunfire. He felt pride stir in his chest. They were battered, bloodied, but unbroken. And unbroken men could win. "Keep pushing," he roared, rising just long enough to send a burst downrange before ducking back behind stone. Above, Torres worked the bolt with grim precision. Her shoulders screamed from the repeated recoil, but she bit back the pain. She had fired more rounds in this battle than in any training exercise, more than she had in any deployment. But stopping was not an option. Each thunderclap from her rifle was a shield for the men below, each echo a promise that they weren't alone. She scanned again, spotting a group of insurgents trying to set up a heavy weapon further down the canyon. Her heart quickened. If they succeeded, the Marines' momentum could shatter in an instant. She inhaled, held her breath, and fired. The Barrett roared, the round tearing through the first man and slamming him back. She worked the bolt, shifted, fired again. The weapon team dissolved into chaos, scattering under her thunder. Below, Ramirez recognized the opportunity instantly. "They're breaking on the flank. Move in." His men surged forward, adrenaline overriding fatigue. Grenades sailed into enemy positions, detonating with bone-rattling force. Shouts of panic rose from the insurgents, their lines unraveling under the combined assault of riflemen from below and the sniper's wrath from above. Private Miller dove into a shallow trench, bullets snapping overhead. He glanced at Jenkins, who was grinning like a madman, teeth white against soot and grime. "We're actually doing it," Miller muttered. Jenkins clapped his shoulder. "Damn right we are." Don't stop now. Together, they rose and fired in unison, their rounds cutting down fleeing figures. The enemy's confidence shattered completely. Fighters who had once poured bullets with discipline now scrambled for cover, firing wildly as they retreated deeper into the canyon. Some dropped their weapons altogether, panic overtaking duty. The trap they had laid for the Marines had become their own. But victory was not without cost. A burst of fire struck near Ramirez's position, ricocheting stone fragments into his arm. He cursed, blood seeping down his sleeve, but waved off a medic. "I'm fine. Keep pushing." His voice was iron, even as pain lanced through him. The men followed his lead, refusing to slow. On the ridge, Torre's chest rose and fell with labored rhythm. Her vision swam for a moment, exhaustion pressing hard against her will. She closed her eyes briefly, just long enough to steady herself, then reopened them to the sight of the Marines surging forward. Their movement reignited her focus. She wasn't done. Not yet. She spotted another cluster of hostiles, attempting to regroup behind a large rock outcrop. She adjusted her aim, calculating the angle. Her finger tightened, and the rifle thundered again. Stone splintered, and one figure fell. She cycled the bolt smoothly, delivering another round, then another, until the survivors scattered into the open. Ramirez's men cut them down before they could reach safety. The canyon now rang with a different sound, not just the chaos of battle, but the rising cries of Marines sensing victory. Push, push. Voices shouted, their rhythm relentless. Each meter gained fueled the next, a chain reaction of determination. Miller found himself laughing between breaths, the insanity of survival bubbling out of him. "We were supposed to die here," he muttered, half to himself. Jenkins answered without looking up. "Not today." His rifle barked again, sending another enemy crumpling. Torres watched them, unseen yet intimately connected. Pride surged through her fatigue. These were her brothers, her purpose. Every shot she fired was for them. Every ounce of strength spent to ensure they lived another minute, another hour, another day. The insurgents faltered further. Retreat became their only option. Ramirez saw it, and so did his men. The ambush was unraveling, the predators now hunted by those they had cornered. Dust clouds rose as fighters scrambled away, their fire dwindling into sporadic bursts. But Torres didn't relax. She kept her eye pressed to the scope, her breath steady. Retreating enemies were still threats. She lined up another shot, dropping a figure who turned to fire one last desperate burst. The canyon echoed once more with thunder, her promise of protection unwavering. Finally, the Marines secured the high ground, taking positions that once belonged to the enemy. Ramirez raised his hand, signaling a temporary halt. The gunfire began to quiet, leaving only the echoes of thunder and the groans of the wounded. His chest heaved as he surveyed the field. They were alive. Bloodied, battered, but alive. And he knew exactly why. Above, Torres lowered her rifle slightly, her arms trembling from exhaustion. Her ears rang from the repeated concussions, her shoulder bruised raw. But her eyes never left the battlefield. She watched as the Marines consolidated, tending to their wounded, preparing for whatever came next. The battle wasn't completely over. Pockets of resistance remained. But the breakthrough had been made. The tide had turned. The Marines owed their survival to the thunder from the ridge. And though they couldn't see her, they knew she was there, watching, guarding, refusing to let them fall. For Sergeant Elena Torres, there was no thought of glory, no consideration of recognition. There was only the mission, only the rifle, only the men whose lives she had sworn to protect. And she was not finished yet. The dust hung thick in the canyon like a heavy fog, settling on rocks, rifles, and the battered uniforms of the Marines. The once deadly ambush had become chaos for the enemy. Fighters scrambled across exposed ridges, abandoning positions and supplies in their rush to escape. Every step they took carried them further from dominance and closer to defeat. Staff Sergeant Ramirez pressed forward cautiously, keeping his men tight. "Hold formation. Watch your sectors. Don't let them regroup," he shouted. Even as adrenaline surged, he was painfully aware of every risk. Explosions still cracked in the canyon, and a few stubborn insurgents continued firing sporadically from behind rocks. Every second they paused, every misstep could still cost lives. Private Miller moved beside Corporal Jenkins, their movements synchronized, rifles at the ready. "I can't believe this," Miller muttered under his breath, scanning the ridges. "We were pinned. We were done for. And now—" He paused, eyes widening as he saw insurgents fleeing in disarray. "Now we're pushing them out." Jenkins didn't respond verbally. He simply raised his rifle, squeezing off careful bursts to cover the squad's advance. They were no longer running for survival. They were reclaiming ground, fighting with purpose and precision. Above, Torres shifted position again. She had been firing relentlessly for hours, her body screaming in protest. Muscles cramped, arms burned from the recoil, but her eyes remained locked on the battlefield below. She tracked the enemy's retreat, anticipating every move. Her aim was surgical, dropping insurgents who tried to reorganize or escape in numbers. Even those who thought they had reached cover were vulnerable, their momentary relief shattered by the crack of her .50 caliber rounds. Her presence was the invisible spine of the Marines' counterattack. Ramirez's men moved with confidence because they could feel at her thunder above, covering every step. Every time a fighter attempted to expose himself, the crack of the Barrett reminded them they were still in the fight, but the rules had changed. One enemy squad tried a desperate maneuver, attempting to flank Ramirez from the far right. Torres adjusted her scope, calculating wind, distance, and trajectory in a heartbeat. The shot cracked, and one insurgent fell before he could even bring his weapon to bear. Another pivoted to help him, and never made it. Their comrades scattered, leaving the right flank exposed. Ramirez noticed immediately. "Alpha, move to secure the ridge. Bravo, cover the left flank." His squad surged forward, exploiting the disruption. The Marines advanced as one fluid unit, pushing the enemy toward a natural choke point where their numbers would be useless. Miller and Jenkins led a small team, moving quickly along jagged rocks and using every boulder for cover. Their muscles ached, lungs burned, but the sight of the enemy fleeing gave them strength. Miller ducked behind a rock and fired at a retreating fighter. Another insurgent tumbled down the slope, groaning, as Miller advanced. The squad pressed on, relentless. Torres scanned for leaders. Her experience told her that enemy morale depended on command. She found one, a tall figure, attempting to rally scattered fighters from behind a partially collapsed wall. Her finger tightened. The Barrett roared, echoing like thunder across the canyon. The man crumpled mid-command, leaving his squad leaderless. Chaos erupted. The Marines pressed harder, taking advantage of the disarray. Ramirez led his men to key positions, securing high ground and cutting off enemy escape routes. Grenades detonated in controlled arcs, flashes of fire and debris scattering the remaining insurgents. One by one, pockets of resistance fell, each broken by the combination of Marines' discipline and Torres' relentless overwatch. Miller paused for a breath, looking up at the ridge, imagining the unseen sniper. "She's still out there," he muttered. Jenkins nodded, eyes scanning the chaos. "And as long as she is, we're not losing a man." The enemy's retreat grew frantic. Some dropped weapons, sprinting blindly into the canyon's narrow curves. Others fired sporadically, desperate to delay the Marines' advance, But without coordination, their efforts were futile. Torres methodically eliminated threats as they exposed themselves, turning desperation into total vulnerability. Ramirez allowed himself a glance back at the squad. "Good work, men. Keep it tight. Don't overextend." The Marines moved like a wave, closing the distance toward the enemy's remaining positions. Explosions, gunfire, and dust clouds swirled around them, but the tide was undeniable. Victory was within reach. Torres shifted again, pain radiating from her shoulder, muscles screaming. Yet she didn't relent. Every round fired was a promise kept. She had trained for moments like this, her focus absolute, her mind a machine of calculation and instinct. One more shot could decide the fate of the fight, and she was determined that the Marines would walk out alive. A small insurgent group attempted to take cover behind a crumbling ridge, preparing to fire on Miller's squad. Torres' eyes narrowed. She counted the seconds for wind, aimed carefully, and squeezed the trigger. A sound rolled down the canyon like an avalanche. One insurgent collapsed. The others hesitated. The Marines seized the moment, moving forward with precision, finishing the engagement. The enemy's morale collapsed completely. Shouts of command turned into cries of panic. They were running not to fight, but to survive, abandoning positions, rifles, and any hope of counterattack. Ramirez's men held the high ground, consolidating positions and sweeping the canyon for stragglers. Dust hung thick, but slowly the firing quieted. The Marines had reclaimed control. The canyon, once a death trap, now belonged to them. Ramirez looked around, chest heaving, surveying the aftermath. Bloodied, exhausted, and bruised, his men were alive, and the enemy was in full retreat. Somewhere above, Torres finally lowered her rifle, arms trembling. She wiped sweat and dust from her face, breathing heavily. Her shoulder ached, her vision swam from exertion, but she remained vigilant. Every Marine below owed their survival to her. She had become the phantom of the canyon, unseen, untouchable, and relentless. Ramirez turned his gaze upward instinctively, though he couldn't see her. Somewhere in those cliffs, a presence had saved them, a guardian whose thunder had rewritten the battle. The Marines didn't know her name, but they would never forget the impact of her rifle. The battle was not yet fully over. Some pockets of insurgents still lurked, but the breakthrough had been made. Momentum, once lost, now surged in favor of the Marines. The ambush that had threatened annihilation was crushed, shattered by discipline, courage, and a rifle that thundered from the ridge. For Torres, exhaustion pressed heavy, but the sight of the Marines standing, advancing, and breathing again was reward enough. She knew the fight had changed. The canyon had been reclaimed, and the men she had sworn to protect were alive. Even unseen, her presence had carved the path to survival. Every round fired, every calculation made, every muscle tensed, had been for them. She allowed herself a brief exhale, knowing the next steps would be consolidation. But for now, the hardest moment, the survival, was behind them. And the Marines, their momentum restored, would never forget the phantom of the ridge whose thunder had carried them through hell. The canyon lay in eerie silence, the aftermath of battle settling like dust on the rocks. Smoke drifted lazily from scattered sandbags. Spent shells glittered in the sunlight, and the cries of the wounded were slowly replaced by the muffled sounds of assessment and regrouping. The Marines moved carefully through the valley, weapons still raised, scanning every ridge and boulder for any sign of danger. But the battle, the deadly ambush that had threatened to consume them, was over. Staff Sergeant Ramirez led the squad cautiously, his eyes sharp, but his heart lighter. He took stock of his men, counting heads, checking wounds, and issuing orders to secure positions. "Good work, all of you," he said, voice strong yet weary. "We're not done cleaning up, but we held. You all made it through. Private Miller stumbled slightly, exhaustion weighing on him as he scanned the ridges above. We didn't just survive, he said, voice trembling. We fought them off. His eyes instinctively swept to the cliffs, as if searching for the phantom who had turned their despair into survival. Corporal Jenkins, dust and blood streaking his face, let out a low whistle. I've never seen anything like it, he admitted. Someone up there. She was everywhere at once. Miller nodded. Yeah, I don't even know her name, but she saved us. Every one of us. Ramirez allowed himself a rare smile, though tight with fatigue. Whatever her name is, she's the reason we're still standing, he said. And we'll make sure her effort wasn't in vain. Every step forward we take now is because of her. Up above, on the ridge, Sergeant Elena Torres finally allowed herself a full exhale. The weight of hours spent firing, calculating, moving, and surviving pressed down on her, but the rush of relief was immediate. She scanned the canyon one last time, her scope finding only scattered, retreating insurgents, some surrendering, others fleeing into terrain where the Marines' pursuit would finish what she had begun. Her arms ached, her shoulder throbbed from recoil, and her body was coated in sweat, dust, and grime. Yet her mind remained sharp, scanning, anticipating. Even in this rare quiet, she knew the battle wasn't truly over until their men were safe. Torres packed up her rifle carefully, checking every part, every round fired or remaining. Her hands trembled slightly, but the skill and discipline that had carried her through the fight remained steady. Ramirez raised his hand toward the ridge instinctively, silently acknowledging the presence that had carried the Marines through hell. Torres, watching him, remained hidden for now. Recognition was unnecessary. Her duty was complete, and she didn't need thanks. Not yet, not ever. Medics moved among the Marines, tending wounds, applying tourniquets, and offering water and reassurance. Corporal Davis, bandaged but upright, gave a grateful nod to Ramirez. We wouldn't be here without that cover fire, he said, eyes scanning the cliffs. Ramirez didn't need to answer. They all knew. The remaining enemy fighters were either retreating, disarmed, or lying incapacitated where they had fallen. The canyon, once a death trap, had been reclaimed. The Marines' momentum had been restored, their lives preserved, and the ambush obliterated. Miller found a small boulder to lean against, closing his eyes for a brief moment. I never thought I'd see daylight again, he murmured. Jenkins clapped him on the shoulder, voice low. You will never forget the sound of that rifle. The Phantom of the Ridge? She's a legend now. Ramirez walked among his men, giving nods of approval, adjusting positions, checking on everyone. His eyes lingered briefly on the ridge above. Somewhere up there, a sniper had altered the course of the fight, ensuring that the Marines could advance, survive, and ultimately dominate the battlefield. He knew he might never meet her face to face, but her actions would never be forgotten. Torres descended slowly, moving from cover to cover, ensuring she remained unseen until she could safely approach Ramirez's position. Her boots slipped on loose gravel, every movement deliberate. She didn't need recognition, but she needed to see the Marines regrouped and intact. That, more than anything, was her reward. As she reached a vantage point closer to the Rangers, Ramirez noticed her figure emerging from the shadows of the ridge. Recognition and relief flared instantly. There she is, he said under his breath, motioning to his men to hold their fire. The squad froze, eyes widening as they finally saw the sniper who had saved them all. Torres' helmet was smeared with dust and sweat, her uniform torn in places from crawling and repositioning for hours. Her rifle, still deadly in her grip, gleamed dully in the sunlight. She lowered it slightly, careful not to appear threatening. Ramirez approached, eyes sharp yet full of gratitude. Sergeant, he said, voice steady but firm, I don't know how to thank you. You saved every one of us today. Hell, you probably saved my life too. Torres allowed a faint nod, her eyes scanning the Marines one last time. She didn't speak. Words weren't needed. Her actions had already spoken volumes. Miller stepped forward, hand extended. Mom, thank you. Seriously. Torres shook her head, small smile breaking through. You don't need to thank me. You stayed alive. That's enough. The humility, almost startling, made the Marines respect her even more. Jenkins, leaning against a rock, let out a low whistle. I don't care if she wants no thanks. I'm going to tell everyone back at base. The sniper on the ridge. She's unstoppable. Ramirez nodded, taking one last sweeping glance at the battlefield. The ambush was over, the Marines intact, and the enemy shattered. Let's secure the wounded, gather intel, and move out. This canyon isn't ours to linger in. But remember this day. Remember who made it possible. Torres adjusted her pack and helmet, glancing back at the now calm canyon. She felt the weight of exhaustion press down fully, her body ready to collapse. Yet a sense of quiet pride filled her. She had faced the storm, and she had protected her brothers. As the Marines consolidated and prepared to move out, the phantom sniper finally allowed herself to step forward fully. Ramirez caught her eye, offering a nod that conveyed more than words ever could. Respect, gratitude, and acknowledgement of a battle won because of courage, skill, and determination. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the canyon. Dust and smoke mingled with the fading light, painting a battlefield that had been turned from death to survival. The Marines walked among the remnants of the fight, carrying the wounded, tallying the fallen, and securing their positions. Above them, the sniper had done her duty, and now she faded back into the ridge, unseen yet forever, etched into the memory of every man alive that day. The canyon had witnessed chaos, courage, and thunder. And in the end, it had witnessed a hero silent, deadly, and relentless, who had turned the tide of battle and ensured that the Marines would live to fight another day. Sergeant Elena Torres didn't seek recognition, but the Marines would never forget her. The legend of the sniper on the ridge, her thunder echoing across the canyon, would be told for years. In a fight where every second counted, where every breath could have been the last, she had been the difference between life and death. And as the sun set over the battered, reclaimed canyon, the echoes of her rifle, her courage, and her presence lingered forever, a testament to skill, discipline, and unyielding resolve.